Oh, you live streaming this on YouTube?
Yeah, you know the vibes, you know what I'm saying? Gotta
Oh,
gotta make gotta make it gotta do right by the peoples here. Um, all right, yo, so here we go. And like I said, we're about to just kind of jump right in. So um essentially today I want to start us off on a really amazing journey of getting into the web. And what better way than to talk to y'all about the world's first website? Take a look at this. Y'all see this? This literally is the first website that was ever created.
oh,
And if you remember from our time in class last time, I was talking to you about the web, right? And we talked about the difference between the internet and the web and how the web was created as an extension of the data transfer processes that already happened over the internet. And when we talked about the web, we talked about several parts of what makes the web special, right? HTTP being a process and protocol for sending information between clients and servers, if y'all remember, as well as the fact that the person that created the web also was responsible for creating several of the tools that we use to send data through HTTP. And much of that data, right, if you remember, is stored in files, right? And those files are connected to what we call uniform resource locators or URLs. And one of the ways that we see the web and interact with the web day to day is through a file type called HTML or hypertext markup language. Hypertext markup language, HTML, is the de facto um, language that we use for creating web pages. And so today, and much of what we're going to be focusing on for the next bit of time is the front end, and the front end of the web experience and the client side is driven by the creation of HTML pages, which we interact with in our browsers for the most part. So what we're looking at here is the first web page. And this was created like by that same guy, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and his team of researchers to explain to people about HTML and about, well, the web, the World Wide Web as a project. And so in this particular web page, y'all can see a couple of bits of text and some hyperlinks, which was a particular innovation at the time to make it so that you can use text, but then have that text linked to other HTML, right? And so here you see Sir Tim Berners-Lee and his team were talking about hypertext, and hypertext is meant to be text that contains links to other texts. And so this was the original aspect of how they started working with things in the web and making it so that people who were building tools within this space could also create their own files that they could transfer from one to another and link in this kind of cool capacity. So I know this is probably like, y'all like, wow, this is basic looking web page, but most web pages look like this, right? And under the hood, what we're taking a look at is the code that makes this work. And all of that code is created as HTML, which we can actually take a look at in our browsers using the Google Chrome developer tools. And so if you're on a browser, most browsers have developer tools that allow you to see the web HTML on the sites that you're working with. And so on Google Chrome, they have some pretty sophisticated tools. I use a browser called Brave, which is built off of Google Chrome. So it has those same developer tools. Firefox has the tools, so does Safari. But if you look at, for the most part, I think you should be able to get to your developer tools. If you right click and you say, you'll see two parts of the tools. One is view page source and the other is inspect. View page source is great because once you click this, it'll show you the HTML for that particular web page. So viewing the page source is basically a shorthand of saying, let's see the source code, and the source code will include some of the HTML. So here we can see the HTML behind that particular web page that we were just looking at, what is hypertext page. And just to kind of talk on the other part of the Google Chrome developer tools, if we use the inspector tool, it will pull up, which y'all might not be able to see because of how my screen is sharing. Let me change this. you'll be able to see a console pop up, which has a couple different tabs related to interacting with the console, right? So the first is the elements tab, which shows you, again, the HTML elements of that particular web page. As you hover over them, it will also highlight those particular elements on the web page, as you can see here. The console refers to the JavaScript console, which in your browser has the capability of running JavaScript. And so here we can use this console to interact and log out things from the JavaScript as well. The sources in the network tabs are very helpful as well. Sources kind of contain all of the source code, and for the particular web page, the network will show you the requests that were made. And so if you remember when we talked about the web last time, we talked about the fact that the web works with this client server kind of relationship, and the responses and requests that are sent out and the responses that are sent back between a client and a server. Here, you can see some of those requests being made for particular data, right? Like this whatis.html is a particular document that clearly is getting sent somewhere. And it returned back with a 300 level status code. If you remember, we talked about status codes last time. Drop in the chat, what does a 300 level status code typically refer to, right? So 200, 300, 400, 500 level status codes refer to different things. 300 typically refers to one particular type of response.
That's redirection.
Redirect, yeah. So it means that in the server, it redirected us to somewhere else, right? And what we got returned back to ended up sending us this web page. But yeah, 200 is for success. 300s are typically redirects. 400s are typically errors on the client side. 500s are typically errors on the server side. So yeah, we can use the Chrome developer tools to take a look at all these things, the network request, source code. But today, what we're focusing on for the most part is the elements, right? And the HTML that comprises these pages. And so it's really cool to know that you can use the Chrome developer tools to take a look at the source code for any web page. Anything that you're looking at on your browser, you can look at the source code to take a look at how the HTML is structured, some of the CSS properties, as well as interact with the JavaScript behind that particular web page. And so it's awesome to see how, for instance, like if we go to a different, let's go to the New York Times. I love showing people this example. So let's go to New York Times, right? And like we talked about, there's a process going on behind the scenes whenever we type something into our browser and press enter that effectively takes what we're looking for, this NewYorkTimes.com, works with our internet service provider to figure out what is the DNS, like to use the DNS to create and to get the IP address for this particular domain, and says, like, it's like a phone book, like we talked about. So it's like, hey, I want to call the New York Times, flipping through the phone book. What's their number? Oh, their number is this. Cool. I'm calling this. My computer's like, I'm gonna call this. Boom. And there's a connection that gets made. And if it can be made, we get back information like this web page. Otherwise, we get back errors that say, hey, we couldn't find that particular site. So if we do the same thing and look at the inspector for the New York Times, I just want to show y'all something very, very interesting. So before we do it, I want y'all to try to take a guess in the chat. How many requests, right? So remember, first thing we can see is the HTML for the New York Times. As I kind of hover over it, you see how it's highlighting certain parts of the site. Remember, the console is for the JavaScript. Sources kind of show us the different source code. And then the network, like I mentioned, shows us a lot more of those networking requests. So my question to y'all, to try to take a guess at it, and you can drop it in the chat, how many requests do you think the New York Times website makes when we make that initial call to that website? You could drop like a range, or you could drop a number, drop something that is your guess. See two, not two, three, two. What do y'all think? How many requests do you think the New York Times website makes when we first load the site up? 50, good, interesting guess. 500, 100. Seeing a lot of different guesses in the chat. Okay, so let's take a look. In order to see the requests in real time and actually count the many of them, you have to refresh the page. So we're going to refresh this page, and then let's pull back up the inspector, and let's take a look at how many requests get made. So you can see here at the bottom the number of requests. So we're getting up there. It's way more than two. it's already in the 20s. Oh, it's in the 40s now, and it keeps going. So we'll let it go for a bit. There's a lot of requests at the New York Times website. But as we're doing this, as it's making these requests, right, you can see the different types of files that we're getting pulled back. Some of the files are documents, and those documents typically refer to HTML documents, which we'll talk about more specifically in a bit. But the HTML document essentially is typically is what we see as the front page of the site, right? The original HTML that we would use for our browser would reload and show us as a part of reloading this site, right? But there's a couple other types of files in here, right? We see another HTML file in here. Here it is with a warning, and we see some .js files. I wonder what y'all think the .js stands for. It's JavaScript, right? So here's actually that HTML page. It took a minute for it to load, but here's the HTML page that's kind of showing this HTML page for the New York Times. We're already at 100 something requests as well. So a lot of JavaScript files, a lot of images, SVGs, right? So every bit of data that we're seeing coming back from this New York Times website has to come back via a request. And so the data is reaching out to the server, right? So remember, the client is reaching out to the server and saying, hey, I want this information. And I'm pulling that information in via these requests. I'm sure there's a couple more requests that are going to be made, but just wanted to make the point that one, every website has its own source code that comprises of the HTML that is made for that particular site, as well as all of the other source files that make up that site as well. So shout outs to y'all. And using the Chrome developer tools will help you see that HTML, as well as interact with some of the networking going on behind the scenes, amongst other things, like you interacting with the JavaScript and looking at the source files and stuff like that. Cool. Give me a thumbs up if you're rocking with me, and we can keep it pushing.
Hey Cam, Professor Cameron Flowers. I saw that that we're live on YouTube. So is that footage pre-recorded later? I'm still attentive to the class. I just wanted to know that because I see that it's live.
My man was like, let me ask you about this YouTube. Can I just look at the YouTube?
No, like I'm a vlogger myself, so I could see that, but I'm just reiterating. That's all.
No, yeah, it's there for anybody to take a look at, bro.
All right.
You know what I'm saying? I do it for the people. That's what we do it for. But yeah, no, you can always take a look at it, and the link to it, to the channel, I put in the Slack, so you can grab it in there.
Yeah, and there's a tab too on the Zoom. I see it.
Dope. Cool, y'all. So every web page has HTML that makes up the front forward-facing part of the web page. And from that first web page that we saw, like this isn't it, but from the first web page that we saw from Sir Tim Berners-Lee to as complicated of a site as the New York Times, what is the common denominator here is that they both are using HTML and using the HTTP protocol to allow for us to connect to the server, pull back that HTML, and visualize something in our browser. All of those different tools and innovations were part of the original kind of web project that Sir Tim Berners-Lee and his team were working on. And you can see more of this if you go to this original site. I'll link it for y'all here in the chat. And if you ever wanted to kind of look back to there, but there is something here where they had a really dope list of the vocabulary and things. I wonder where it is. It here in the hypermedia? Yeah, so they had this like list of terms, which I thought was really cool, because if you look at some of these terms, for anyone that's ever been familiar with HTML and learning HTML, and most of y'all have learned a little bit of HTML, some of these terms probably are familiar to you based on some of the tags and elements you were working with. An anchor element, right, is one of the most important elements in HTML that helps us create these types of links. So you can see from their first bit of work in their project that they were already thinking about these things and how to make these parts of the experience of you writing your HTML. Of course, they called it all hypertext before it kind of turned into hypertext markup language, for better words. But the idea is still rooted here in the same. So here's where they defined a browser, a program that allows a person to read hypertext. So if ever anybody asks, well, what's a browser? Well, that's what it's doing. It's an app that's meant to help you read hypertext. So cool. A lot of different language here that I think gets at some of the core of like what HTML is really doing for us. Here's where they define the web: a set of nodes interconnected by links, often the set of nodes which are interconnected, often the set of all nodes which are interconnected. So we'll talk about a little bit more about what this means in a second, but just wanted to show y'all that behind every web page is some HTML that corresponds to what we eventually will see in the browser. So you, as a practical web developer looking to get into the field, looking to start building client-side experiences, front-end experiences, you need to know HTML, right? That is one of the most important first bits of skills to develop. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about how to build our first little web page and do it in a practical way that can support us in some of our other professional goals, like getting a job doing this as well. So that is the goal. So first things first, in order to do this, what I want to do is build a web page and kind of talk through some of the ins and outs of it, show you some interesting tools that you can use while doing it. And then I would love for y'all to be able to practice this on your own. To do that, I wanted to introduce a couple of tools that are going to just be important for you both in your professional journey as well as kind of in relationship to working together with me. And the first is talking about GitHub, which is a website and an application that we use very commonly in the web dev space and as just engineers and just generally in the engineering space as well. We'll talk a lot more specifically about GitHub in a few weeks, a few sessions, but just want to introduce it to you because it's very important as a tool. And GitHub really is a cloud-based platform that allows for us to host what we call Git repositories on the cloud, right? And a Git repository is essentially a storage software for our code as we're working on it. And so whether we're talking about HTML files or we're talking about way more complex files and like React files, or we're talking about backend files, whatever files we're talking about, typically we need some way to store those files in an efficient way that allows for us to refer back to previous versions of the code at different moments in time. That's what Git and GitHub are meant to help us do. Git is the underlying tool that allows us to do this kind of saving of the code at different moments. And GitHub is a place where we host those Git projects, for lack of better words, so that not only do we have a place to save them separate from our personal computers, like we're saving them in the cloud, but we also can use GitHub to facilitate things like collaboration, more professional features when it comes to reviewing and marking up code, as well as now like doing things like running pipelines to do automations on our code when certain things are happening. So GitHub is a really important professional tool, which we'll get really familiar with as we keep hacking together. But underlying GitHub is Git, which is a source code management software that does what I mentioned. Basically, if you think about it, I like to give the analogy, like if you've ever played video games, like you're playing Grand Theft Auto and you're like, I want to save the game right now, just in case something happens and I got to come back to the last checkpoint. Well, Git would be that same idea for your code, right? You want to do saves at different moments to have different checkpoints that you can say, oh, I want to refer back to that checkpoint and start over from there, right? By using a tool like Git, you're able to create that system of saved versions of your code that then you can refer back to at different points in time and keep a better control over your experiences as you're building out your own files and whatnot. So the first thing I'll do is ask y'all, if you haven't already, to take a second and download Git on your computer. Just go to this website, git-scm.com. And there should be a little download link somewhere here on the bottom on this little computer looking thing based on your operating system. So for me, I'm on a Mac. So I would just see this Mac release and I can just download it. But you also can download it for your Windows computer or for your Linux-based computer as well. So downloading Git will be helpful for y'all as you're building out projects, and you'll see me use it, and we'll talk a little bit more about how I hope that y'all can start using it in a bit. But just take a second, just start the download and keep listening to what we're talking about today, and we'll get back to it in a little bit. The goal for today is to talk more about building out a personal site, right? Building out a little practical little web page that does a little bit more functional stuff for us to kind of talk about the core elements of the process of working with HTML, and then also to give y'all an opportunity to practice some of this for yourselves and challenging yourself to build something that you can use to show, hey, I know a little bit of HTML. I'm a little bit in my front end bag right now, right? So this is the goal, right? So here's a quick little site I made. Funny enough, I made this when I was in y'all's shoes, first learning a little bit about HTML a couple years ago. And as you can see, I've always had swag that hasn't changed. You know what I mean? That just only grew. And but basically what we're looking at here is a simple web page, right? So just like I did before, I can inspect this page to pull up the inspector and take a look at some of the elements. And so here we see a little bit, let me zoom in a little bit here for y'all. I think this will zoom it in. Okay, cool. So here we see some of the HTML for this particular web page, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we recreate it in a different, on our own, and just kind of see what's going on from scratch. But HTML is a very interesting language because it creates elements in this very interesting nested-like structure. So HTML, the biggest thing you need to know about HTML is that HTML corresponds to elements that you'll see on your browser and when you're loading HTML pages. Those elements can contain code that is more like metadata for the site to know, and then code that is responsible for the visual elements that we actually see. The three most important tags that we use to create elements in HTML are the HTML tag, which is the default tag that contains the entire document of HTML. The head tag, which basically is a container for all of the elements that are related to that metadata or code that the site might need for itself to know, like things like the title of the site, or things like what other files might we be linking to, et cetera. Things that aren't necessarily visual, but things that are important to make a connection between HTML and some other data would be in the head, which is all about metadata and things of that nature. And then the last tag that's really important, and we can see clearly it's important because it's highlighting a bunch of stuff, is the body tag. And the body tag is the tag that we use to hold all of the visual elements of our HTML. So typically when we want to build a web page, we're going to be thinking about tags that are part of the body, right? Things like, so we'll talk about divs, but divs are little containers, and like things like this H1 tag, which as I highlight over this H1, you can see how this is highlighting over that part of this web page that's my name, right? Inside of this other div, you can see I have this image tag, and the image tag is corresponding to my little headshot, right? And then underneath that, I have some links, and those links are anchors that are clearly being connected to these parts of that site as well, right? So the body is really responsible for all of the elements that you visually see on the page, right? So as you can see, once I highlight over body, the whole page gets kind of highlighted over, but highlighting over the head, nothing really ever gets highlighted, because the head, again, doesn't correspond to any visual elements as much as it corresponds to elements related to what this page might need to know about itself. So here's an example, like I added a couple metadata tags to just show you the point that you might pass metadata. For people who have ever heard of like search engine optimization and things of that nature, one big way that we use meta tags is for putting descriptive text about a web page into the web page. And so those meta tags would live in the head. And typically we have things like the description and like titles and social media things, so that not only then can like Google find our web page easier with all of that metadata, but we can then use it to do things like try to rank well on social media or get found for certain keywords and stuff like that. All of that corresponds to things that might be in the head of the HTML page, alongside things like linking to a particular style sheet, right? So HTML is one part of the web front-end experience, and it's corresponded with the stylistic part of that experience, which is created through CSS. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then after you have kind of the structure in HTML, the style with CSS, that's when you start thinking sometimes about how can I make this more dynamic, more action oriented? And that's when you might include something like a JavaScript. But for right now, we're not really going to focus on the JavaScript aspects of stuff, or we're going to focus more on just kind of like just creating a basic HTML page and kind of do that from scratch and show you guys how that works, and some tools that will help you along the way. So cool, we'll use this as a reference because you know the vibe. Sometimes as you do live coding, it just be like, oh, how do I do this again? But so we use this as a reference, but I'll show you kind of how I would go about creating a web page from scratch again, and do that in the context that will also show you how I might use Git at the same time. So first thing you need to do in order to work with HTML is you need some type of a text editor. You could write HTML in Microsoft Word and save it as an HTML file, but that would just make your life a lot more stressful for no reason. And typically as engineers, we like to use tools that make our life easier rather than harder. So we've created a number of different tools. There's some that are built into your computer and some that are built as external downloads for you to make the process of writing code easier. The tool that I use predominantly in my development work as a text editor is called Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short. And so I'll just show you all the VS Code website real quick. I don't get paid by Microsoft, so you know what I'm saying, this ain't y'all can choose whichever way you want, but you know what I'm saying? Like, hey, Visual Studio Code has treated me well for most of my programming life, and I definitely still use it as my kind of code editor of choice. And so it's a free program. Once you download it on your computer, it will give you the ability to open a new project, kind of like so. So I just clicked it, and you know the vibes. My computer's like acting like I am just doing this for the first time. So. So VS Code is a text editor, and it is a pretty great text editor because one of the reasons I like it is because it's lightweight. It has a number of different features in it that make it very helpful for development. Like you can see here, different extensions you can download and tools you can download to make your development experience that much easier. So I'm gonna just create a new file in VS Code, and as you can see, it pulls up this little window, And once it fully loads, we should see it start a new file for your boy. I'm sorry, it's still getting in the way. So just start a new file. Cool. And there's a couple different ways to start projects in the coding space, right? So this, as you can see, this just kind of opened a blank file for me. But sometimes this doesn't really help in the process of creating efficiency in your workflow, right? So one thing that I like to do with any project that I'm working on is actually create a new folder for a project, right? And so it's kind of interesting because they don't really make like, it's not like, oh, new folder. But what I like to do sometimes is open a folder in VS Code and then just create a new folder through my browser so that I can save that in a more efficient way, right? And so as we start working on more projects, you'll probably see to yourself like, oh, I want to organize this better, right? So sometimes, you know, I encourage people to just create a folder called projects on your computer and save all your work there, right? For me, typically I have a folder on my computer that I use for my projects. And so I put stuff in here. So sometimes you'll see me saving stuff in this folder for myself that just kind of organizes some more of my projects in an easier to understand way for myself. So what I will do is just for the sake of it, just kind of show you like, oh, like I'm just going to create, let's just create a new folder in here. And I'm just going to say, I'll just say practical HTML. I like to name things without spaces, just so that my life's easier for finding them later in the terminal. So it's kind of just a practice that I like to do. But as you can see, I just created this folder and now I can open it. And by opening it in VS Code, what this is actually going to do for me is create a new folder where any file that I create now in this project will be saved in one location. So hopefully you see why that's helpful, because now it's just going to save me time looking for that file. And if I add any more files, I already have a folder. And it turns out that this will help make it easier for me later when I'm working with like Git and stuff. So I encourage you to create a folder when you start a new project, and then you can create a new file. And so there's several ways you can create a new file in VS Code after you start a new project like this and open a folder. You can click this plus button to create a new file. You can use the file drop down to create a new file. Any real way you want. What's cool about VS Code is, like I mentioned earlier, it has a number of programming languages built into it. So you can start a file and then it can detect what the file is supposed to represent. And it also can do that by way of the extension, the file extension. So anytime we want to create an HTML file, we always have the .html extension as the ending of the file. So if I want to create a new HTML page that is focused on like this little thing we're doing, I might call it like index.html. And index is typically the word we use for describing an HTML file that will be like the root file in a bigger project. So sometimes we have multiple HTML files, but the idea is that the index will always be the first file that in a folder, that it will be the first file within a folder that a computer will look for to kind of show. So this is good to know, just good practice to know kind of where this language is coming from. So right now, all I've done really is start a new project, new folder, open that folder in VS Code, and created a new index.html file. As you can see, that file is blank. There's nothing in there, but this is where we would then be writing our HTML code. So before I keep going, just want to check for y'all. Give me a thumbs up if you're still following along and what I'm doing is making sense. And I appreciate it. Just to, you know what I'm saying, just make sure my people's with me, keep my people with me. That's my goal. All right, cool. Today I got a green smoothie next to me. I'm lit. I ain't getting dehydrated today. So you see me leaning over awkwardly, just know I'm sipping the green smoothie. All right, lit. So HTML, like I told y'all, is built in a very similar way, no matter what HTML project we're talking about. Let me count in my head before I give you a fake number. There's 4 things that every HTML file has, and we can take a look back at some of these ones to see. This one is really interesting because this was like the first HTML. So it's like a little bit different than like a typical HTML file nowadays. But you know, this was because these were the guys creating this in the first place. But if we look at more like, let's look back at like that New York Times source code, right? So if I go to the view page source, I can see the HTML more directly, right? And then just to compare that, maybe we'll use GitHub since I have that up right now, and then just kind of, right click, view page source. So here we can see, let me just move them over to one another so we kind of can see them side by side, right? Here's the GitHub code base for the HTML. A lot of crazy things going on in there, right? This code is not going to be the easiest to read because it's sophisticated. They're doing a lot of interesting things to make their HTML as dynamic as it can be. Some of it involves a lot of JavaScript, but we're really only focusing on some of the core things that make this source similar to this source, which is the New York Times source. So really what I want to show y'all is every HTML page document starts with this declaration, for lack of better words, that says, I am an HTML document. That's what this little declaration is doing. It's saying, I'm an HTML document, which just makes it easier for the browser to know, hey, this is an HTML document. It's very meta. It's like, I am a HTML document. You're like, you are a HTML document. You're right. So every page kind of has that little declaration at the top. So for us, in our little baby index HTML page, it'll be good to add that doc type HTML declaration, just so that we know whenever the browser looks at this, that it knows that it is an HTML file indeed that we are working with. So the last question. Oh, go ahead.
So what happens if you decide to decline the use of the HTML doc type? Does it change?
That's a great question. So it doesn't turn out to be something that's too hectic in terms of the browser recognizing still that it's an HTML file. But I think it's like, we're trying to follow best practices, right? And you don't want to write code that then somebody's like, well, why don't you have this at the top? Because most of the time we have this at the top, right? So it doesn't really turn out to impact the browser too much, especially when the file ending is .html. But it is the case that typically we keep it in there for best practices. Make sense?
Yeah, got it.
No problem. Also, I encourage y'all to hack around, like whenever I'm doing something, it's easier for y'all to just put it in, try it, take it out, see what happens, and say, that was interesting. That's what being an engineer is all about, is really kind of testing and building stuff and testing and seeing like, oh, well, why does this work the way that I expect it to? So anyway, every web page has this, every front end HTML page has this declaration to say, hey, this is an HTML document that I'm working with. The 3 tags that are super important that you're just gonna need to know, because these are just the tags, this is just how it works. The first one is the HTML tag itself. So I'm gonna close this tag off and you're gonna see VS Code do something very interesting. So first of all, the HTML tag is wrapped around in these angle brackets, right? And these angle brackets kind of wrap around each tag. And what we see is, what VS Code just did for me is close that tag. So what is a closing tag, right? Well, HTML is all about nesting different elements in a document. So the HTML document is really, the HTML tag is the tag that corresponds to the entire document within that file. So the browser will always look for that entire HTML tag. And as you can see for us in, if we look at the GitHub source code, here's the HTML opening tag for GitHub. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom, or it wouldn't actually be at the bottom, but we scroll toward the little bit further down, we would see the closing tag. Matter of fact, I wonder if I could just find it. There it is, right? So 179 lines later, it's the closing tag for the head. And all of this code, like I told you, inside of the head is responsible for some of the metadata and some of the links that need to happen for that web page. So you can see here's GitHub putting a bunch of metadata for things like search engine optimization, and for when you know how sometimes nowadays we can share a link and it comes back with a little preview when you share it. Some of that is done by the metadata that you can, meta properties that you can put into it so that your phone or your messenger app or whatever recognizes that link and shows you some of those things like the image and the title and all of that other stuff. But neither here nor there. The head is a important element. The HTML tag, the HTML tag is an important element. Oh, that's my bad. I'm like bouncing around between two tags that start with an H. So what I was gonna show you, I showed you the HTML tag, right? The opening one, here's the closing one happening at the end. So the HTML tag wraps the entire HTML document. So for GitHub, this entire document is wrapped with an opening HTML tag and this closing HTML tag on line 22424. That's an angel number, just for, I don't know if y'all fuck with angel numbers, but it's an angel number. So the HTML tag is our entire document in one place. There's two tags inside of the HTML tag that are important. That's why I was getting a little jumping the gun. The first one is the head, right? And that's what I was talking about. The head is the HTML tag that refers to all of the metadata, links, connects us to, we can connect scripts like JavaScript files like this is doing here in there as well. We put the title of the web page in the head. The head is just responsible for, like I said, a lot of the metadata. So if we go back to our little baby HTML and we say, all right, I want to create a head. As you can see, again, the head also is an element that opens and closes. Closing elements have a slash before the name of that element it's closing. So that's how you can tell the difference between an opening tag and a closing tag. Closing tags will always have this kind of slash with the name of the thing it's closing. So VS Code is doing something really cool for us. And this is one of the reasons why I definitely say to use a text editor. It doesn't have to be VS Code, but most text editors do certain things like this, which make your life easier. Like one, it's showing you where the tag is getting closed. So here we open this HTML tag here. It shows you that, hey, after line 4 on line 5 is where that tag eventually gets closed, which is very helpful. Another thing it did was it auto closed it. So as soon as I wrote it, it closed it for me. So I don't forget to close it, which sometimes if you forget to close a particular element, it might give you a little bit of errors in how your HTML shows up. HTML isn't like a programming language that gets compiled. So it's not like it'll give you an error that something's wrong, but it will, you'll see visually something is off, right? And most times that comes down to, hey, they don't have tags closing in the right way or something in that nature. The third thing that VS Code and most text editors do that's really cool is that if you highlight over part of the code, this is one of the reasons I love VS Code, is like, boom, it's actually giving me links to some of the documentation on what does this tag and this element correspond to. So remember, HTML tags and are referring to elements that will be part of our HTML document. So if I hover over the head, it says the head element represents a collection of metadata for the document. I pretty much said that. So, hey, you know what I'm saying? I feel it. And then we hover over the HTML element. It says the HTML element represents the root of an HTML document. We'll talk a lot more about what that language of root and stuff means probably next time we link. But what you need to know is that the document of HTML is wrapped in this big HTML tag that then has the head where we put our metadata. And then the last tag that we need to just kind of have a formally written out empty HTML is the body element. The head represents all of the metadata. So like all this stuff that like you can see from GitHub, like Google site verification stuff and like scripts and things like this, things that we don't need to see, right, are in the head. But now let's just kind of take a look at the New York Times and kind of switch up what we're looking at. If we look at the body, right, the body starts showing all of the visual stuff. Here we see things like divs and a bunch of, in the New York Times website, we see some anchors to some links to some New York Times articles, right? We see some tables and rows of data that they put in there. And the New York Times website is pretty sophisticated. So it's not like as simple as, it's not as simple as maybe like my little website. If we go back here and take a look at the inspector here, right? This will show us again, like the body is all of the stuff that we're actually seeing. The head is all the stuff that is like, the head would be all the stuff that we don't see that is important, but the body is everything visual that we would end up seeing. So in our new HTML, right, we want to have not only our document kind of declaration, we want to have our HTML element to kind of create a document. And inside of that, we would expect to see a head and a body. These are the most important elements to have in any web page that you're building out. All HTML documents have at least these elements inside of them. So I'm going to save this file and just pause real quick one more time and just give me a thumbs up if you are rocking with your boy and this makes sense. You got a sense of what these different parts are doing, you know what they're up to, you know the vibes, you're like, dang, my man Cam lit, he broke that down like a champion, you know what I'm saying? He's super relatable.
Yeah, we rocking.
Oh, you rocking? All right, lit. I mess with y'all. That's what's up. I'm gonna drink my green smoothie as a celebration. All right, cool. So
I have a quick
got
question.
the first. Go ahead.
So that means that all of the code that you write must be so both the header, the body, and the divs and everything must be in the nested tag of the opening both the HTML. So
yeah, anything that you want to see within the document would be within the HTML, would be contained within the HTML tag. Yeah, like we talked about, the body would be where and we'll see this in a second, this will be where we put the code that we want to see. And the head will just be kind of important for other aspects of the code that we want to write. Does that make sense?
Okay, so that means that anything that is not inside of the HTML tag is not going to execute, right?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's not gonna execute in the way you expect. Like sometimes, depending on how you wrote it, like you might add other tags that then do certain things. But this is one document, and if you want things to show up in the framework of that one document the right way, it would have to be kind of structured in that inside of that. Checking the chat real quick, making sure. The extension does everything for us within VS Code. Yeah, there's a lot of cool extensions in VS Code. We're actually going to talk about one in a second. But yeah, so cool. So I have this HTML file now made. It's inside of this folder. I'm feeling lit, feeling good. And I just want to show you all one thing. So just to get the ball rolling, what I'm going to do is start doing some adding some HTML in here and kind of talking through some of the elements as I do it, right? So if you were to be recreating like this little web page that I have, right, you might want to first show up with like a little like tag, some type of element that's going to show your name in like a big way, right? So there's a number of different text-like elements that we can use in HTML. And actually, this is a great opportunity for me to introduce y'all to one of my favorite resources for looking at and learning more about HTML, which is the W3 Schools. The W3 Schools is an organization committed to exposing you to all of the things you need to know about web development. And they have a number of free tutorials, free references, and exercises and tools and resources that you can use in your journey. And I have no shame in saying, like, I definitely go and check out certain things on the W3 Schools pretty often, even as I'm working on larger professional projects still. And one of the references that I love in the W3 Schools, they have a bunch of references for HTML, but one of the ones that I like to take a look at and show people is the tag reference, which essentially kind of gives you a list of all the different HTML tags that you can use. Like, as you can see, there's a lot. So ask yourself, seeing me scroll down this big list, right? You think everybody memorized these? You know, some of them, yes, because you just use them again and again and again. But sometimes no, right? There's just so many tags to know. So it's very common that you might have to look up, hey, what's the HTML tag to do blah, blah, blah. That would be a good example of something you might have to look up in order to fulfill what you're trying to do for your page. So for instance, what we're talking about is, oh, I want text, like I want to show some text in the HTML, right? So turns out that there's a lot of different ways that we can use text in HTML. One way is that regular text is considered a part of HTML. So we could just write some text and that text could still theoretically show up. So first, what I'll do is just to show y'all, let's just do a test. I'm going to just write test, testing HTML in here, right? And as you notice, I put it in the body, right? I will say why, it's a rhetorical question, but why did I put it in the body? Right? Think about what we were just talking about before. Why didn't I just put this in the head, right? What I'm gonna do now is save this. And so now I have this HTML file, right? If you're following me, I made this project on my computer. So theoretically, if I were to open like my little file explorer and then kind of go to my, go through my files for y'all and show you inside of my little computer science folder that I use, I have that folder, right? Practical HTML. And inside of there, like we created an index.html file. So this is a real file that I made on my computer, right? So what's cool is remember that what is the purpose of a web browser, right? If we look back at what it was saying here, well, a browser is meant to be a program to allow us to read the hypertext. So that's what the browser is doing for us. It's giving us the ability to read the hypertext. So I'm going to show you something really cool that some folks might not know if you haven't worked with HTML before, but you can always open your HTML file in your browser, right? And see what's going on in there. So I'm just going to go to that same file that I just showed you inside of my folder and open it in my browser. As you can see, it's getting that little URL and boom, here's my little HTML file, right? I could do the same things that I was doing before, like view page source and inspect. I'll open up the inspector for now. And what we see is our HTML document. Got our document declaration. We got the HTML tag, we have our head, and we have our body. And so remember, I asked that rhetorical question, why didn't I just write that thing inside of the head? Well, remember, if I did that, we wouldn't see anything, right? The body is where the visual stuff starts to even show up, right? So cool. So look, I just typed some text and it still shows up. So as an element, text is clearly cool in the HTML. In HTML, we could just write the text. So testing HTML is pretty cool. So if I were to actually try to build this out like myself, maybe I just put my name, save this. I can reload this and boom, there's my name there, right? It's not as it's not the complete same, but you can get the idea, right, from how this is working here. If I wanted to leverage some other elements for the text, right? Maybe I'm looking at the references here to say, oh, well, what are some other elements that I can use for text? The green smoothie was calling my name. I'm sorry. Tried to do it all smooth, but it didn't work. One of the elements that you just gotta know that come up with text are the headings, the H1 to H6 headings. So the W3 Schools not only shows you the reference, it also shows you how to use it in an HTML document, right? So here this shows you, hey, there's different headings that you can use to define different text. And what a heading does that's different than you just putting the text in is, one, it gives you an actual element around your text that you can then customize a little bit more. But the headings are created to give certain different sizes, font sizes to your text. So I'm just gonna, for the sake of this example, just wrap this up in an H1. And as you can see, VS Code clearly added the closing tag after or before my stuff. So I'm just gonna move this so it's inside. So as you can see, just from this little bit of an example, we have a lot of nesting going on in HTML. First, the main document, then we have this head inside of that document. Then we have the body inside of this document with another element inside of the body, right? So there's a lot of like kind of like one element wrapping another element. And that is very common in HTML. And one of the things that also can get very confusing as you're building out more sophisticated sites. That's one of the reasons why it is kind of helpful that VS Code does this work to like close tags for us and all of that, because sometimes you might not remember, hey, I got to actually close that tag to see what I'm to have everything work the way that I want in this nested kind of document. So the H1, right? So I just added this, I'll save this, and whoops. No, that's my bad. I'll save this, and now inside of the browser, go back to our little file and refresh, and boom, now I got a nice little bigger weight to my name. I got some clout on me now, you know what I mean? I feel lit. So I got the first part, which is the name, right? The next part of this particular page was creating an image, right? So you might be like, well, how do I get an image in HTML, right? That literally is a great question to Google. You'd be like, how to create an image in HTML, right? And I'm just showing you this not to be funny, but to actually show you that these are the types of questions you actually might be asking as a front-end developer when you're getting started. So there's no shame in asking a question that's specific to what is it that I want to see in HTML, right? I'm doing this to give y'all a code for how to do that type of research for yourselves and show you really there's no shame. Actually, there's a lot of resources for you in that regard, right? So one of the first resources that pulls up is the W3 schools, again, which is why I told you about it, which also gives you not only how to do it, but some practical examples. If you click try it yourself with any of the W3 schools resources, it'll show you the whole HTML so you can see. Cool, so just like we were trying to do, here's one that has the heading, right? And then our image, right? So clearly the image tag has a couple different parts to it that are important to name. We have the image, which is the name of the element that we're creating. And then we see these different bits of information in here that are important for the image to have while it is showing, in order to show something, right? Clearly the first one is called SRC or source. This refers to the source file that is going to be referenced by this image. And we'll talk about this in a quick second when we bring our own in. The second one is called alt. This is referring to alternative text. So this is an accessibility best practice. If you're building out a web page, it's good to think about how can I make this efficient for people who might be visually impaired, right? And so adding alt text to your images makes it so if somebody's visually impaired looking at your website, they can still see what, or hear, for lack of better words, what's going on within that image that you put up there. And then we see some other things here, giving data on the width and the height of that image. So these elements inside of our HTML tag are what we call attributes. So attributes are a part of HTML that add a layer of complexity to what we already saw, which is, hey, you could just declare a tag, nest it with some other data, right? We can also add attributes to certain tags to give that data more specific information that it might use or it might need in order to show something important for us in a bigger picture sense. Dylan, did you have a question or were were you just kind of rocking, vibing?
No. I was just asking the question. I was saying, so how does it know that's like from the directory from your computer that? So basically, HTML, it can search and it knows from the directory where that picture is found. Like you don't have to call the root of like where document, then find pic.
So yeah, we'll talk about that in one literally right now. So basically, you're asking like, well, how does this know where to get this image, right? And that's where it gets into. There's two ways for this to be the case, right? So let's go ahead and add our image into this document, right? So I'm going to go back to our little code, and underneath my H1, I'm going to just put that image tag that I just got, right? Again, VS Code is cool because you can highlight over the attributes and it'll also describe some of the attributes. So here it describes the URL. So it says the image source should be a URL. This URL should correspond to the image we want to see, right? It says it's mandatory. We need it. If we don't have it, then we aren't going to see anything because it doesn't give us information on what the image actually needs to show. What's important to know is that this is a URL, Uniform Resource Locator, right? The URL can be one of two things. It can be either a link within your project folder, like to a file inside of it, or it can be an external URL, like one that actually exists on the web. So to show you what I mean, right? Let's start with the easiest one. You know, life is kind of crazy right now because you could like Google yourself and things will come up. So let's see how much the world knows about me. Just
well, I thought, and I was here thinking that Google was going out of business.
You thought Google going out of business? No, bro.
Yeah.
Well, some of these are not me, clearly. Let's put it that way. That's crazy. But that is me at the front. You know what I'm saying? I will
The
say
first one is you.
you don't think this one is me? Why are you saying that? I'm just
No,
kidding.
the first one. Yes, that one.
I just kidding. I'm messing with
No,
you.
you went Michael Jackson. You changed the complexion.
We don't advise. So cool. So look, this is actually pulling up my GitHub profile image. Now my browser's tweaking a little bit. But what's cool about like the way the web works is everything on the web is corresponding to other URLs. So Google is just an app that's showing you other URLs on the web in a more efficient way. That's what they did with their search engine and why they became such an important tool. But if I go ahead and look for this image address, right, copy image address, I can see a particular URL that is from GitHub. This is my GitHub user profile image that they're showing me in Google. And when I use this, when I go to this image, right, URL wise, you can see that this is pulling back some data. This is pulling back my GitHub user profile image. So if I use this URL, right, that's already freestanding as data in the web, that's tied to a server, is already kind of hosted somewhere, right? I can use that source image. I can use that as my image source, basically. So if I put that in here, I'm going to change the alt text to say Cam smiling swagged out. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? I gotta let people know when they look at this site, when they hear this site. You know what I'm saying? I gotta let them know. They need to know your boy was out here. So I'm gonna save this, right? And then if I go back to our little HTML page and refresh, boom, right? Now I got a nice little profile image inside of there for myself as well, right? So that's the first way, is I can use source data, I can use the URLs for other data that already exists online. So that's the first thing. The other way is for me to use actual data from my computer, because right now this HTML file is being, I'm creating and seeing this HTML file on my computer. If you look real closely, you can see that this URL is really different than the typical URLs that we are used to, right? A typical URL online would start with HTTPS // but here we see it starting with file : // which basically is to, cut to the chase, this is showing me a file on my computer. If y'all were to type this in on your browser, which some of you probably did, because I know y'all are like that, it didn't work, right? It's not gonna work because you don't have this file on your computer with the same path. So it's not gonna come up with anything. But if I were to go to a already hosted image, right? Like here you can see that this is starting with HTTPS, which means that this is actually a web, this is data on the web that is coming back. So the thing is, on my own computer, when I'm working on a project on my own, I can always add files. I could always use references to files on my computer to put into my HTML. But you know, you got to ask yourself, is that even really good practice? Because at the end of the day, you're not going to serve the file up from your computer in that capacity. So typically, I would say it's a good idea to just use externally hosted images. But if you wanted to put an image in that was tied to your particular project, right? So this is another reason why I like creating folders, because now what I can do is, let's say, I'm pretty sure I got a headshot in here, right? Let's say I got this headshot and I'm like, cool, I'm gotta remember to move that back. But now I have this other bit of data inside of my folder, right? Cam_headshot. If you look real close, you can see the path name tied there, right? One thing about files is that the way that files work is that it will look first within the folder that this file is already in. So let's just see if I do /, right? I can then, the dot is saying, look in the current folder. The / is basically saying, look within the current folder that we're in for a file called this, right? And you can see VS Code kind of helped me with that one. If I save this, right? And remember, this was the file that came back from the GitHub little profile thing online. We just changed it some. So now what I would expect is that we would see a different file, right? And clearly the proportions are messed up. My face do not look like that. OD, you know what I'm saying? but yeah, you get the point. You can use files from your computer in your project as well. How this will play out in an actual project is you might have files, you might save your code in a way that then you can make reference to your folder of files versus just a what's it called? Just one HTML file. Like you might have a project that has an HTML file, it has some images, it has some other files inside of it. And then if you do, then you can make reference to those files like so. But again, like I said, sometimes it's better to just have your files hosted externally so that you don't have to save your projects with all of these files, which increases the size of your file, of your project, right? So just adding one image probably changed the size of this project by an order of megabytes, right? Like there's now, and if this is a big image, like a professional image, like it could be even a lot of megabytes, which you don't want your project to have to be so big because that makes it so that it takes longer to load, right? So typically we don't really want to add unnecessary bits of data here that we don't need, especially if you can go get away with saying, oh, I could just use a regular URL to represent that particular file. Quick thumbs up if you're rocking with me still. I know we're getting in the weeds of some specific stuff here, but just want to kind of show you that. It was a good question from my homie. So thanks, y'all. Appreciate that. Cool. So I'm gonna resave this and just reload one more time. And cool. And so the last thing that is here that we're missing is I had some links at the bottom, right? And so the links are actually really interesting. The links use the anchor tag, which is one of the most important tags to know in HTML, because this is what allows you to create that ability to go from one HTML page to another, right? So to real quick before I draw it in there, just want to show you again. If maybe you Google it, maybe you go to the reference of the HTML thing and you say link, right? Or link, right? And you see that, oh, there's a couple things that say stuff about links. Oh, here's an anchor, defines a hyperlink. That's kind of what I want, right? Is a link to something else. And so here you see the reference for an anchor. And I'll just bring it in there and then we can mess with it, talk about it a little bit more. I'll put one in here. And what I'll say is, so basically, let's just take a look and dissect it a little bit. The anchor element is an interesting element because just like the image, it uses attributes. As you can see from these two elements, they use different attributes. So it's important to look sometimes. This is another reason why you might look up a tag reference, is to see what are the attributes that come up with that particular tag, right? So here we see the href attribute defines as another one that defines a URL, but the image uses an attribute called source, right? And the anchor uses an attribute called href, but both refer to a URL. So this is again why you might need to look up what attributes or what elements do what, right? And again, just to make the case that you don't always know everything when it comes to being a developer in that sense. So we have the anchor. It uses an href to define a link, and the link will then be like, if I save this one time, just so you see, the link will define like a place that we want the user to be able to go to if they click on it. So clearly clicking on this link takes me to the W3 schools. And that's cool, but for right now, not necessarily what I want to do. So maybe I'll do something like visit my GitHub and change this to be a URL to github.com/camUnity, right? Which is my GitHub profile. And then if I save this, clearly stuff's not like, we'll talk about this stuff not looking all the way right in a second, but clearly I got this, I got to refresh this. And then it says visit my GitHub. And as you can see on the bottom corner, you see that link is going to my GitHub. If I'm gonna hold command to open this in a new tab, and then you can see that this is going to my GitHub. So if somebody click that, it would take them to my GitHub. So basically we got what we need here. But as you can see, some of what's going on here is that it's not looking as good as we want it to look, right? It's like not looking like a saucy website. It's like, okay, it's giving web page, but it's not giving, I want my friends to see this web page, right? Maybe we want to do stuff like format things and add some, stylistic elements to make this a lot more visually appealing. And that's where the CSS comes in. Right? So CSS is an extension of HTML. We need the HTML to put all the things we want to style on the page, but we use CSS to then say, okay, I'd like to make this page that much more stylistically appropriate to what my standards are. So, CSS itself is also a important part of the front-end development experience. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in detail later, but I'll show you a little bit of CSS and kind of just show how we might want to use CSS in this capacity. So just to kind of make my life easier, let's go back to that other one that I made, right? So as you can see here, I have a little bit more of a structure to this site. I have kind of all my text is centered. The image, everything's really centered, and there's still some like more kind of style to like these like sections here, right? So just to show you one more time, if I inspect this page, one thing that you can see, we already talked about how you can see the HTML for a particular site here, right? You can see all the body, and that should make sense. The other thing that is important to know is that with these elements, you can also see some of the CSS that comes back. So inside of the body, as I click on some of these different tags, you can see some of the different CSS properties that I started messing with, right? So in this particular div, there's some stuff here where I was changing the font, doing some text alignment and stuff like this. But all of these like stylistic things are happening within a particular file in this project that I created called my CSS styles.css file, right? So again, we'll talk more about the CSS specifically in our next bit of stuff and just kind of add to this. But I want to show you this so for the folks that are very interested in, well, how do you make yours look nicer? I use CSS, and essentially you can create a CSS file that defines the different visual elements that you want your page, your HTML page to conform to. And the last thing I'll show you before I take a sip of this green smoothie is how in our HTML, we can create a connection between our HTML and the CSS that we want in our file using a link, right? So there's a lot of ways to connect CSS to your HTML. That's one of the reasons we'll talk about at a different time. But I will say one of the more professional ways that you see it done increasingly in projects is by creating a separate file to represent your CSS and then linking that file in your HTML head, right? So here, I'll just show you a quick example. If I add this line of code to my head, remember the head is responsible for things like this. It's like connecting this HTML to another file, right? Because this is not doing anything visual, it's just creating a connection. What does do something visual is how the CSS works. But the link element is a tag that we use to create a relationship between a CSS file and an HTML file. And now with this like little line of code that just says, hey, I'm gonna add this link to the style sheet that's gonna be called style.css. Remember the href tag, the href attribute refers to a URL. And this URL is clearly, there's no HTTPS or anything in front of it. So this is also expecting there to be some file in this project called style.css. So I can just create that real quick, style.css. And this file, right, style.css would be where I would start writing my CSS out. And so without getting too in the weeds about CSS and also give you some stuff to try on your own, right? We created this connection between the CSS and the HTML, right? And this would be where I can do certain things to connect to do some styling there to make it so that the styling of any of these elements, oops, let's go back to the one we were working on. Any of these elements that I have, I can change. Like if I want this font to be different or font size to be different, if I want the image to be a little bit smaller, or like anything, right? If I want to change how the relationship between this image and this link is going, right? I could do some of those changes via the CSS in this connection we just made. For the interest of finishing this up on more of an HTML tip, all I really want is right now is just for that link to be on its own line. So I'm just gonna do a little kind of hacky thing here and just add a break element, which is creating a line break. And this should just push this to its own line if I'm not tweaking, and there it is. So now it looks a lot better, right? That was not so bad. But if I want to go the extra mile, I can start thinking about what might be some ways to stylize this. Like if I want to do that centering of stuff and all of that, like that would be where the CSS would be really helpful. And I don't really have HTML elements that could just do that for me. So that'll be my challenge to y'all, is if you want to start kind of saucing this little thing up that we just did, think about how you might be able to connect that to some CSS for yourselves. And CSS also, just like the HTML reference exists on the W3 schools, they have a really robust CSS tutorial and reference. So you can see here's how CSS actually is structured, right? So just to do one to like make it so y'all can kind of get a glimpse, right? So in this style.css, I can create a CSS rule. And here, this rule is basically referring to an element in my document, my HTML document, right? So that's where all of this kinds of gets connected. HTML, we write tags that correspond to different elements in the HTML document. The document is all the stuff within the HTML tag that we see here. By creating this link in this head to that particular CSS sheet, style file, we're saying that whatever this CSS file is going to start calling, like as an element, is going to refer to the elements inside of this HTML file itself. So basically, when we say H1 in this CSS file, because this CSS file is linked to our original HTML, it's going to look and see this H1 because this is the only H1 inside of our body tag, right? So CSS is going to style things within the body, right? And the thing is right now, how CSS works, right? It targets a specific group of elements. It could target one element if there's only one that match, or it could target a group of elements that match. So in this H1, we only have one H1, so it's only going to match to one element, which is that only one we have. And what it's doing right now is it's saying, hey, I want to do something with the color. If you highlight over it in VS Code, it tells you what it does, sets the color of the text. And then the text align, if you think about what it might do, is lining up the content also. And so I'm gonna just do this, like let's just change it from white because the background is white, do like blue or something, and then save this. And what we would expect is that if we go back to our little project file and refresh, right? We can see now that those CSS rules were applied to that H1, the text align as well as the color, right? So that would be how, if you wanted to go the extra mile real quick and sauce up your thing real quick, you could use some CSS to do so. For me right now, I don't really, like I said, I am just more interested at least to get it going on us getting our HTML together, but I just wanted to show you kind of completed how the HTML CSS connects, how then you could start going crazy with the CSS, but it all will relate to the first part, which is what's the HTML that you wrote for this document and what are you kind of hoping for the skeleton of your site to be? So cool, I'm going to pause right there for another little check for understanding. If you're rocking with me, give me a thumbs up. This is kind of the last bit that I wanted to show. And there's one last thing I want to do before we break, and then yeah, we'll be on our way to our practical web dev journey. And also, right after I do this, I'll pause and give y'all space to ask any questions. But first, the smoothie. That drawing is so good. Y'all don't understand. Like, it's hard being a teacher out here. You know what I'm saying? Give love to y'all as teachers, man.
Where did you get that smoothie from then?
This gigantic looking at it's from a spot called Smoothie King. It's pretty lit, pretty lit. All right, cool. Let's finish this up real quick, and then we can key it up and charlar and todo, ¿sabes? Let's do this. So, okay. So we just finished a really big milestone in our web dev experience. We wrote our first HTML file. We even connected it to some CSS. Like I said, I don't know if I'm gonna keep that, but I know that it's there, right? And so just to, let me actually clean up some of these old Johns that I had open up. These inspector windows throwing me off a little bit. So like I said, I might not keep these style rules in my CSS because, you know, they were just done to show us an example. I'm gonna just comment them out for now. And matter of fact, I'll just comment out this whole little CSS thing. Just so it goes back to how it was by the time we ended. And so this clearly would just be all the HTML that we put in there in one go. So what I want to show you now is how, if we were doing this professionally, how we might want to like get this project saved in a way that will make it easier for us to reference and add changes to and all of that in the end. And so what I want to show you is how we might use Git to hold this project and keep a record of this project for ourselves. So there's two aspects of it I want to show. I'll show it real quick, and then I'll give you some more information on it for you to look into for yourself. So first things first, I just want to go back to my project file, and just for the sake of getting rid of some extra files I don't need, I'm going to get rid of that little headshot file that I that I had in here, and then just delete it. That way so that this folder only really has the HTML and maybe that CSS that we had before. The next thing I want to do is, like I told y'all at the beginning, is going to be really important for you to download Git on your machine, because Git is actually the tool we use to start doing some of this saving of our work in a more sophisticated way. So once you've downloaded Git on your machine, you should be able to, if you're on a Mac, you should be able to open a tool on your computer called your terminal, which I like to open either by doing like command space bar to pop in this thrown up and just type terminal. And terminal should then come up as an option. And then what I did is saved it to my little dock, so I have it here. If you're on a Windows machine, you can do Windows E and then type command, and you should see you can type command prompt, and command prompt should open up your equivalent to a terminal. So these are one ways to open up the terminal, but just so happens that VS Code is super lit, and we can do a lot of this also in VS Code. So if I go back to my VS Code folder, right, for my project, again, another reason why I like to have a project folder is for this particular reason, which is inside of VS Code, I could click terminal at the top and open up a new terminal. And by having Git installed on my machine, I'm able to then, inside of this folder, so you can see here, right, because I have this as a project in a folder, the terminal immediately opens up to that folder, which is super helpful and way more helpful than having random files and I gotta find the files, right? This just opens immediately to my folder, which allows me to see all of the files that I've been working with, right? So Git is a command, and Git is a software on your computer once you downloaded it, and you can use commands to use Git to work with your projects at different moments in different ways. Once you install Git, like once you've done this little download, you should be able to open the terminal and in like VS Code like this. And you should be able to do like a git --v to just get back. Oops, not dash, my bad. I'm tweaking. I'm doing that last minute teacher scramble where I start tweaking. Git -v should show us the version, right? So this is showing us the version number of Git. This is just a good way to confirm that you have it downloaded on your machine, is to be able to run a command and have the version. Just the fact that I typed git --v and something came back also shows that I had Git installed. Because if I didn't and I tried to do this command, it would just say command Git not found, which means that we don't have Git actually downloaded on our machine. So here's what I want to do. I want to create a Git project to hold this code. And we're going to see how this becomes helpful for us a lot more as we continue in the class and doing these kind of sessions. But what I want to do is the first bit of commands to make a project in Git. So the first thing I want to do is git init, which creates a Git repository for me inside of my folder. So there's a lot of crazy semantics about what that means, but really all this means is that I'm basically setting this project up to be using Git to hold all of the saves to save versions of the code. So after doing the git init, it creates a new repository for me. And now I want to start using the git commands in order to save this code that we just worked on. So the first thing I want to do is a command called, just to make it clear so you can see it easier, is git add. And git add is a command that allows us to add files for Git to keep track of. So what I'm going to do is say git add, and I'm going to use a special, so basically with git add, I can say things like git add index.html or git add and specify the name of the files that I want to add, right? And if I do another command called git status, it will show me all of the files that are now being saved for Git to keep track of for us. Clearly, one of the files that I just did was add index.html, but there's another file in there that I also want to keep track of. So I could also do git add style.css if I want to, or a shorthand to add all of the files within a folder is just to say dot, git add dot. So git add all the files within my folder. So I'm gonna just do that real quick. And what this is doing is just saying now, okay, I'm gonna add all of the files inside of this folder to be added to the saved version of this code that I will be keeping track of. right? Some of the other stuff you see are things like on branch master. You don't have to worry about that too much yet. Branching is a more kind of intermediate thing to know about with Git. But what we're doing is setting up that like Grand Theft Auto, save the game kind of thing, right? I'm saying add all these files to my saved game, basically is what git add dot did, was add all these files to my saved game. Now that I've added all these files, the last thing I can do for Git is to commit the files. So a commit in Git is basically like me saying I want to save this particular version of the game, right? So first I say, what do I want to add to the save? Then I say save it, right? So to save it, right, I'll just say git commit -m, and we use the -m to just give ourselves a helpful message with the save. So I'll say git commit -m, and I'll say adding or initial, I'll just say, let's just say adding initial files for something simple, right? So these are my initial files for my Git, right? So the way that Git works is it allows for you to take a look at all your saves over time using another tool, another shortcut called git log, right? Which basically will show you all of the saved versions that you've made. So we use git add to add it, git commit to make the save, and we use git log to see the saved versions. So now I have a saved version of this code. I can always refer back to it, and it's saved on my local computer. Real quick, I just want to show you this and just put it up there, and then y'all can slide. If I want to connect this to GitHub, which is something we're going to be doing quite a bit in these kind of next few weeks, I just want to show you this so you see how it would go. I did all of this work locally on my computer. I did all this work locally on my computer to save a version of my code, right? And now if I want to actually put this version up for people to see on GitHub, all I got to do is use the GitHub website to create a new repository, which is going to hold that code, right? And inside of this GitHub repository, we're going to see a lot of interesting things. I'm going to just show you what we got to do. And then again, we're going to talk way more about this in the next couple of sessions. So I'm just going to create a repository. I'm going to call it practical HTML. And inside of this, I could say simple HTML site for my dope students community. I want it to be public so anybody can see it. I normally skip these steps because these are optional. So you don't necessarily need to do any of these things. Sometimes if you click like add a README for some and stuff, it messes up what we want to do. So I just kind of put the name of the repo, put the description, and then create the repository. I'm just showing you my workflow so y'all can get a sense of how we might do this in the future. Next, we see that GitHub gives us some interesting insight as to how to connect our project to GitHub, right? All I need to do after setting up a GitHub account and doing some stuff with authentication, which I'll send you more information about, all I need to do is add the link to GitHub to my project. So I'm just going to copy this line that says git remote add, right? And inside of, go back to my terminal on VS Code, I'm going to say, hey, git remote add origin. So this line basically connects the local project in Git that we made to GitHub and says, hey, now this project is connected to GitHub. GitHub does some stuff to change the name of the branches. So you could just do this or do this just for the sake of it. Following instructions, you know what I'm saying? This just changes the name of the branch. We'll talk about what that does and when it makes sense. But then the last step I need to do is to push the, I keep opening my terminal. It's a force of habit, y'all, I'm sorry. The last thing I need to do is push it. And so git push is gonna push the local code to GitHub. So I'm just gonna push this, and as you can see, no errors, everything is going right. If I refresh now, let me just take a screenshot of this for myself later. And then if I refresh, you can see now that my code from my project is now on GitHub, right? I have my HTML file that we were working on all in here with the style sheet. And the one commit that is in there is the commit that we made locally that said, hey, adding the initial files. So now that I have this saved on GitHub, this will make it very easy for me to make some changes, and I can give y'all a link to this so you can see the code yourself. I know that was super quick to see all the stuff in Git and GitHub, which is something we could talk way more about. But I just want to show you how I would end like now this little bit of development that I just did in a practical way. So yeah, we'll talk way more about Git and GitHub and connecting those dots. But now that we have this up on GitHub, I think we're at a good place to stop and let that be. So thank y'all for the time and your attention.